These are 8 foods that fed entire civilizations across North America for thousands of years before a single European set foot on the continent, and most Americans alive today have never tasted any of them. The food systems indigenous peoples built were so sophisticated that roughly 1/3 of every crop grown on Earth right now traces back to their domestication. Yet the actual dishes those crops were used to make have largely vanished from the modern table. Here is what was actually being eaten. Number 8. Mesquite flour. Out in the deserts of what is now Arizona and northern Mexico, the Tohono O'odham built an entire calendar around the harvest of mesquite tree pods, naming one of their lunar months U'us Wihogdag Masad, the mesquite bean harvest moon. Ripe pods were pounded with stone pestles in bedrock mortars, and that turned out to be the only effective preparation method, because metates would cause the mass to become too sticky to work. The flour was winnowed away from the hard seeds and pressed into dense, shelf-stable cakes the harvesters called mesquite turtles, which could be broken apart and rehydrated whenever food was needed. Cabeza de Vaca, the shipwrecked Spanish explorer, encountered this food during his 8-year journey across the Southwest in the 1530s, and he described how the Indians gave him a great quantity of mesquite bean flour, pounding the beans in deep holes with clubs the thickness of a man's leg. Naturally sweet, gluten-free, and packed with soluble fiber, mesquite flour sustained desert civilizations for thousands of years in landscapes where almost nothing else would grow. Number 7. Camas Bulbs. Up in the Pacific Northwest, a blue-flowered lily called Camas produced bulbs so important to Plateau and Pacific Northwest tribes that one Oregon State University researcher described them as the plant equivalent of salmon. Pit roasted in earth ovens lined with hot rocks and moist vegetation, then sealed under bark and soil. The bulbs cooked low and slow for 24 to 72 hours. And that long heat was not optional. What it accomplished was a chemical transformation, converting the bulb's indigestible starch called inulin into fructose, turning a hard, bitter root into something that tasted like a sweet potato, but sweeter, with a flavor closer to molasses than vegetable. Lewis and Clark stumbled into a camas field in June of 1806, and Lewis put down one of the most beautiful passages in his entire journal, describing how the Quamash was now in bloom, and from a short distance it resembled lakes of fine clear water, so complete a deception that on first sight he could have sworn it was water. What Lewis did not know was that the destruction of Camas meadows by settler livestock would later help trigger both the Bannock War of 1878 and the Nias Purse War of 1877. Number 6. Acorn Flour. Across California, acorns were not a backup food or a famine ration. They were the staple, the equivalent of wheat in Europe or rice in Asia, and an estimated 75% of California's indigenous population depended on them as a primary food source. A single Yokut family could consume between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds of acorns in a year. The preparation was elaborate, because acorns contain bitter, toxic tannins that have to be leached out before the flour becomes edible. Women perfected a process of grinding the nuts into fine meal in bedrock mortars, then spreading the flour in sand basins beside streams and pouring water through it for hours until the bitterness disappeared and the meal turned sweet. 1,185 mortar holes sit in a single limestone outcropping at Chaw'se Indian, Grinding Rock State Historic Park in Amador County, the largest collection of bedrock mortars anywhere in North America. The flour was cooked into mush by dropping fire-heated stones directly into tightly woven, waterproof baskets, which is a technical achievement that allowed boiling water without any pot at all. Number 5. Maple sugar. Across the Great Lakes in the Northeast, the Ojibwe called the early spring month Zisbakwadoga Gidzis, the sugar-making moon, and entire families migrated to hereditary sugar bush camps to tap the maples. V-shaped slashes were cut into the trunks with stone tools, and hollowed-out elderberry or sumac twigs channeled the sap into birch bark containers. Birch bark, remarkably, does not burn when filled with liquid, which made it the ideal vessel. There were two ways to concentrate the sap before metal kettles arrived. The first was freeze concentration, where sap was left in shallow birch bark vessels overnight, and because water freezes before sugar does, the ice that formed on top could be broken off and discarded, leaving sweeter liquid below. Colonel James Smith, captured by the Lenape in 1755, recorded watching squaws making sugar this way, and when he asked them if they were not throwing away the sugar, they told him no. It was water they were casting away. Sugar did not freeze. The second method was hot stone boiling, where heated rocks were dropped into birch bark troughs full of sap and replaced repeatedly to keep the liquid at a boil. Number 4. Wild rice. The Ojibwe called it Manoomin, which means good seed, and an older name, Manoomin, means the Creator's grain. It is not actually rice. What grows in the lakes and rivers of the upper Midwest is an aquatic grass called Zizania palustris, and according to Ojibwe oral tradition, it is the reason their entire nation is where it is today. The Anishinaabe once lived along the Atlantic coast, and the Seven Fires prophecy warned them to move westward, following a sacred Megish shell. They were told they would know they had found their chosen ground when they reached the food that grows on water. Centuries of migration ended at Madeline Island in Lake Superior, where they recognized wild rice as the fulfillment of the prophecy. The harvest itself is ceremony as much as labor. 2 people work in a canoe during the wild rice moon in late August. The poler pushes through the rice beds, while the knocker uses 2 carved cedar sticks called Bawaigana Kug to bend the stalks over the canoe and gently tap the ripe grains loose. Crucially, not all the grains fall. Some drop back into the water to reseed the lake for next year, and that is deliberate, sustainable harvesting built directly into the method. December of 2018 brought something the world had never seen, when the White Earth Band of Ojibwe passed the first law in the world, recognizing the legal rights of a plant species, declaring that Manoomin possesses inherent rights to exist, flourish, regenerate, and evolve. Number 3. Nixtamalized corn. This is the most important food on the entire list, and it is also the one whose absence killed more than 100,000 Americans. The word comes from the Nahuatl Nixtamali, and it describes the process of soaking dried corn in an alkaline solution, usually wood ash lye or slaked lime, before grinding it into mesa. Invented in Guatemala somewhere between 3,200 and 3,500 years ago, this single step transformed corn from a calorie source into a complete food. Untreated corn contains niacin, which is vitamin B3, in a form the human body cannot absorb. Nixtamalization unlocks the niacin, makes the amino acid tryptophan bioavailable, increases calcium absorption by 750%, and reduces dangerous mycotoxins by up to 97%. Without this process, corn-heavy diets cause a disease called pellagra, with symptoms remembered as the 4 Ds: diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death. When Europeans took corn back to the Old World after 1492, they took the grain, but left the knowledge behind, and the result was catastrophic. Between 1906 and 1940, more than 3 million Americans came down with pellagra, with over 100,000 deaths, primarily among poor sharecroppers in the American South. Indigenous peoples who nixtamalized their corn had never suffered from pellagra, not once in 3,000 years. Number 2. Buffalo. The American bison sustained an entire civilization that stretched across the Great Plains, with estimates of the pre-contact population running from 30 million to as many as 60 million animals. By 1884, after deliberate slaughter as government policy, as few as 325 remained. The phrase you have probably heard that Plains tribes used every part of the buffalo is not poetic exaggeration. It is documented fact. Meat fed families fresh, dried, and pounded into pemmican. The hides became tipis, plus robes, clothing, and shields. Bones became scrapers, knives, needles, and shoulder blade hoes. Sinew became thread and bowstrings. Brains served as a tanning agent. Stomachs became cooking vessels. Dung dried into buffalo chips. the critical fuel source on a treeless plain. The tongue was the supreme delicacy. Children would rush to a freshly killed animal, squirt gallbladder bile directly onto warm raw liver, and eat it on the spot. Here's the part most people get wrong. All of this happened before horses arrived. Spanish horses did not reach the plains in significant numbers until around 1700, which means horse-mounted buffalo hunting was only the last 150 years of a tradition that stretched back thousands. At Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, archaeological evidence shows the site was active for at least 5,500 years, with bone deposits reaching 12 meters deep. Drive lanes lined with 500 stone cairns extended 10 kilometers from the cliff, and runners dressed as wolves guided the herds toward the edge. Number 1. The Three Sisters. The number 1 food on this list is technically 3 foods, but they cannot be separated, and that is the entire point. The Haudenosaunee called them Di-o-hako, which means our sustainers, and the 3 sisters are corn, beans, and squash, planted together in mounds in what is now considered the most sophisticated companion planting system in the pre-modern world. Each plant supports the others in ways the others cannot do alone. Corn stalks grow tall and straight, providing a natural trellis for the climbing beans. The beans, in turn, host bacteria in their root nodules that pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil, fertilizing the corn. Squash, with its broad leaves spreading along the ground, shades out weeds, retains soil moisture, and uses prickly stems to keep raccoons and other pests away. Modern agricultural experiments have confirmed that the Haudenosaunee Three Sisters polyculture produces both more energy and more protein per acre than any single crop system grown in the same conditions. The nutritional logic is just as elegant. Corn provides the amino acid methionine but lacks lysine. Beans provide lysine but lack methionine. Together, they form a complete protein with all 9 essential amino acids. In Haudenosaunee tradition, Sky Woman's daughter died in childbirth, and from her buried body grew the 3 sisters. Corn came from her breasts, beans from her kidneys, and squash from her navel. Samuel de Champlain described the system in 1605, writing that he saw corn raised in gardens with 3 or 4 kernels planted in mounds 3 feet apart, with 3 or 4 beans planted alongside them, growing up and interlacing with the corn and keeping the ground free from weeds. Every food on this list tells the same larger story from a different angle. These were not primitive diets or starvation rations. What we are looking at are the products of tens of thousands of years of agricultural science, nutritional engineering, and ecological management built by people who understood that food was not just calories but identity, ceremony, and medicine all at once. The destruction of these food systems was not accidental, it was policy. But the revival is real, and it is happening right now. Wild rice has legal personhood. Sean Sherman, an Oglala Lakota chef, won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in 2022 by serving a menu that contains no wheat flour, no cane sugar, no dairy, and no beef. Just the foods on this list, and others like them. Roughly 1/3 of the food eaten on Earth today comes from plants first domesticated in the Americas, and Native Americans documented over 1,600 plant species for use as food. We have only just begun to understand what was lost, and what is still here, waiting to be remembered. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and drop in the comments which of these 8 you would actually try today.